There is a man sitting in a corner office on the 42nd floor of a glass tower in Manhattan. He is not the loudest person in the building. He is not the most charismatic. He does not post motivational quotes on social media at 6 in the morning. He does not drive a flashy car or wear a watch that announces his success before he opens his mouth. His colleagues barely notice him when he walks through the lobby. His neighbors think he works in accounting somewhere. His childhood friends remember him as the quiet one, the one who listened more than he spoke, the one who sat at the back of the class, the one nobody thought would amount to much. He is worth $47 million. He built it quietly, deliberately, and almost entirely alone. Now think about the loudest person you know, the one who talks about their investments at every dinner party, the one who is always announcing their next big move, their next deal, their next opportunity, the one whose Instagram feed looks like a highlight reel from a luxury magazine, the one who seems to be everywhere, doing everything, meeting everyone. Where are they financially? If you are being honest with yourself, the answer is probably not where you would expect given the noise they make. This is not a coincidence. This is a pattern. And it is one of the most overlooked patterns in the entire history of wealth building. The people who build lasting, deep, generational wealth are very rarely the people making the most noise. They are the quiet ones, the listeners, the thinkers, the people who say less, observe more, and move with a kind of calm deliberateness that the loud world around them mistakes for passivity. They are not passive. They are precise. There is a difference between being quiet and being weak. There is a difference between stillness and stagnation. There is a difference between a person who has nothing to say and a person who chooses not to say everything they know. The quiet person has learned something the loud world has not yet figured out. And what they have learned is worth more than any stock tip, any business trend, any motivational seminar, or any overnight strategy that promises to change your life in 30 days. What they have learned is this: wealth is not built in the noise. Wealth is built in the silence. This audiobook is for the quiet ones. The ones who were told they needed to speak up more, promote themselves more, be seen more, be louder, be bolder, be more. This is for the person who sits in the meeting and says nothing, but goes home and sees everything that was wrong with the plan everyone else was cheering for. This is for the person who reads instead of scrolls, thinks instead of reacts, and builds instead of performs. If that is you, then listen carefully, because what follows is not just a philosophy. It is a system, a blueprint built from the lives, habits, psychology, and strategies of some of the quietest and most financially successful people who have ever walked this earth. 7 chapters, 7 truths, 1 transformation. Welcome to the Quiet Millionaire. Chapter 1. The Quiet Advantage. Why silence is a wealth strategy. We live in an age that has confused volume with value. Somewhere along the way, the culture decided that the person who speaks the most must know the most, that the loudest voice in the room must have the strongest ideas, that visibility equals credibility, that presence equals power. And so millions of people have built their entire professional and personal identity around being seen, being heard, and being noticed. And most of them are broke. Not broke in the dramatic, catastrophic sense, not penniless, but financially hollow, living from income to income, unable to explain where their money goes, carrying the performance of success without the substance beneath it, wearing the clothes, driving the cars, eating at the restaurants, posting the pictures. But behind the curated image, the numbers tell a different story. Now look at the other side. Warren Buffett is one of the wealthiest human beings who has ever lived. He is also, by the accounts of nearly everyone who knows him, one of the quietest. He reads for 6 hours a day. He does not attend many conferences. He does not tweet his strategy in real time. He does not announce his moves before he makes them. He lives in the same house he bought in 1958. He drinks cherry Coke and eats at the same diners. His public persona is warm, gentle, and almost deliberately understated. He has generated more wealth than almost any human being in the history of capitalism. Charlie Munger, his partner for decades, was famously described as a man who could sit in silence for hours and emerge with a clarity that took other people years to reach. He read obsessively, he thought deeply. He spoke rarely in meetings, but when he did, what he said changed the direction of billion-dollar decisions. This is not a coincidence, and it is not a personality quirk. It is a mechanism. Here is what silence actually does, not philosophically, but neurologically and strategically. When you are talking, you are consuming. You are consuming attention, energy, and time, and you are producing very little new information for yourself because you already know everything you are saying. You are, in the most literal sense, spending without gaining. When you are listening, you are accumulating. You are gathering data, context, subtext, and intelligence. You are learning what the other person values, fears, wants, and misunderstands. You are mapping the terrain of the conversation and identifying gaps, opportunities, and leverage points that the speaker is exposing without realizing it. The quiet person in a negotiation is almost always winning. Not because they are mysterious or intimidating, though silence can certainly create both effects, but because they are learning while the other person is performing. Think about the last negotiation you witnessed or participated in. Who talked more, and who got the better deal? In study after study on negotiation dynamics, the person who speaks less, asks better questions, and waits longer before responding consistently outperforms the person who leads with a strong pitch and fills every silence. The quiet negotiator gathers information that changes their position. The loud negotiator reveals their position before they have gathered enough information to protect it. But the wealth advantage of silence goes beyond negotiation. It extends into decision-making, which is arguably the most important skill in all of wealth building. Every financial decision you will ever make is preceded by a moment of choosing, and the quality of that moment depends entirely on the quality of your internal environment. A noisy internal environment, one filled with social pressure, status anxiety, emotional reactivity, and the constant need for external validation, produces impulsive, ego-driven decisions. These are the decisions that look like opportunities in the moment and look like mistakes in the rearview mirror. A quiet internal environment, one cultivated through stillness, reflection, and the deliberate reduction of external noise, produces something entirely different. It produces clarity, and clarity is the most underrated wealth-building tool on earth. Clarity tells you when an investment is genuinely good versus when it is merely exciting. It tells you when a business partner is trustworthy versus when they are simply charming. It tells you when a risk is calculated versus when it is just reckless. It tells you when to act and when to wait. And the difference between those two decisions is often the difference between wealth and disaster. The quiet person has more access to clarity because they have cultivated an internal environment that is not constantly flooded with noise. They turn off the financial news, not because they are uninformed, but because they understand that financial media is designed to provoke emotional responses, not rational ones. Fear and excitement sell advertising. Calm, rational analysis does not. So the quiet person reads annual reports instead of watching CNBC. They read biographies of investors instead of scrolling Reddit forums. They sit with ideas for weeks before acting on them, and this slowness, this deliberate, almost maddening slowness, produces results that the fast movers cannot touch. There is another dimension of the quiet advantage that almost nobody talks about, and it is the social dimension. Quiet people are significantly better observers of human behavior than talkative people. This is not a moral judgment, it is simply the result of where their attention is directed. When you are talking, your attention is largely inward, on what you want to say next, on how you are being perceived, on whether you are making the impression you want to make. When you are listening and observing, your attention is outward, on the person in front of you, on their behavior, their patterns, their tells. This makes quiet people extraordinarily good at reading people. And reading people is a superpower in business. It means you can identify which employees have genuine talent versus which ones are simply good at seeming talented. It means you can spot which business partners will honor their commitments and which ones will find reasons not to. It means you can sense when a market is driven by genuine value versus when it is driven by hype, because you are watching the humans behind the market, not just the numbers they produce. The quiet person builds wealth partly because they are almost invisible to the people who would otherwise manipulate them. Salespeople cannot read them easily because they do not volunteer their desires or their fears. Peers cannot pressure them easily because they are not competing for approval or status. The financial system that profits from your impulsivity and your insecurity cannot find a foothold because the quiet person has reduced their surface area for manipulation to almost nothing. They do not need to look wealthy, so they do not spend to look wealthy. They do not need to be admired, so they do not make admiration-seeking financial decisions. They do not need external validation, so they do not respond to the signals that trigger irrational behavior in most people. They move through the financial world like water moving through rock, patient, persistent, invisible, until the moment you look back and realize the rock is gone and the water is everywhere. This is the quiet advantage. It is not about being introverted as a personality type. It is about developing the habits, the disciplines, and the internal posture of someone who has learned to do their most important financial thinking in silence. Anyone can cultivate this. Anyone can learn to speak less and listen more. Anyone can learn to create the internal quiet that produces clarity. Anyone can learn to move more slowly, observe more carefully, and decide more deliberately. But most people will not. Because the world rewards noise in the short term. Loud people get attention. Attention feels like power. Power feels like wealth. And by the time most people realize that the performance was producing the feeling without producing the substance, decades have passed. You are listening to this because you understand, or at least suspect, that there is another way. There is, and it starts with understanding what quietly wealthy people actually value. Not what they say they value, what they actually demonstrate through their behavior, their habits, and their choices, day after day, year after year, in the silence where no one is watching. That is where the real story begins. Chapter 2. The Introvert's Edge. How Stillness Builds Mental Capital. There is a concept in economics called human capital. It refers to the skills, knowledge, experience, and capabilities that a person accumulates over a lifetime and translates into economic output. Most people think about human capital in terms of formal education, professional credentials, years of experience. But the most important form of human capital is one that rarely appears on a resume. It is the quality of your thinking, not your credentials, not your degrees, not your job title, or your years of experience in a given field. The quality of your thinking. And this is where the introvert, the quiet person, the still person, has an edge that is almost impossible to overstate. Research on cognitive performance has consistently shown that deep, focused, uninterrupted thinking produces qualitatively different results than fragmented, distracted thinking. This is not a matter of working harder or being smarter. It is a matter of the conditions under which the brain is allowed to operate. The brain, given sufficient stillness and sufficient time, is capable of pattern recognition, creative synthesis, and strategic insight that simply cannot emerge in a fragmented, overstimulated environment. Quiet people, by default, create more of these conditions. They are less likely to constantly check their phones, less likely to feel the anxiety of being out of the loop, less likely to spend their cognitive bandwidth on social performance, less likely to consume endless streams of other people's opinions and allow those opinions to colonize their own thinking. They protect their mental space in a way that most people do not even recognize as a form of wealth building, but it is one of the most powerful forms of wealth building there is. Here is why. Every major financial decision you will ever make in your life, every investment, every career pivot, every business launch, every real estate purchase, every partnership, every risk you take or refuse to take is the product of your thinking, not your information, not your network, not your luck, your thinking. Information is available to almost everyone now. The internet has democratized access to knowledge in a way that would have seemed miraculous to any previous generation. The difference between the person who builds wealth and the person who does not is very rarely that one of them had access to information the other did not. The difference is in what they did with the information. And what you do with information is a function of the quality of your thinking. The quiet person builds mental capital through several mechanisms that are worth examining closely. The first is deep reading. Quiet people tend to read more than their extroverted counterparts, and they tend to read differently. They do not skim for highlights. They do not just consume the summary version. They sit with books the way a craftsman sits with a complex piece of work. They read slowly. They pause. They think about what they have read before they move on. They come back to passages that challenged them. They let ideas marinate over days and weeks before drawing conclusions. This kind of reading builds something that surface-level information consumption cannot. It builds a mental model of how the world actually works, not how it appears to work, not how it is described in headlines, how it actually functions at the level of human behavior, economic incentive, historical pattern, and systemic cause and effect. The person who has spent years building rich, accurate mental models of how the world works has an almost unfair advantage over the person who has spent those same years consuming fast information. The mental model builder sees patterns earlier. They recognize traps before they step in them. They identify opportunities before they are obvious. And they do all of this not through any supernatural intelligence, but through the accumulated output of thousands of hours of quiet, focused, deliberate thinking. The second mechanism is reflection. Most people never reflect on their financial decisions. They make them, live with the consequences, make another one, live with those consequences, and repeat this cycle for decades without ever pausing to extract the lessons. They are accumulating experience without accumulating wisdom. And the difference between experience and wisdom is reflection. Quiet people reflect. They keep journals. They sit quietly after a significant decision and interrogate their own reasoning. They ask themselves what they were afraid of, what they wanted, what they assumed, and whether those assumptions were accurate. They hold a conversation with themselves that most people never have. This practice, over time, produces a kind of self-knowledge that is extraordinarily valuable in the financial world, because most of the worst financial decisions people make are not bad because the information was wrong. They are bad because the emotions, the biases, the ego-driven needs that were driving the decision were wrong. And you cannot correct what you cannot see. The quiet person sees themselves with unusual clarity because they have practiced looking. The third mechanism is solitude. There is a difference between being alone and being lonely, and quiet people generally understand this distinction deeply. Solitude, chosen, purposeful solitude, is one of the most productive states a human being can enter. It is in solitude that the brain's default mode network, the system responsible for creative synthesis, future planning, and deep pattern recognition, is most active. It is in solitude that the insights emerge that do not come during meetings, during conversations, or during the constant stimulation of a connected life. Some of the most consequential ideas in business and finance emerge during periods of deliberate solitude. Bill Gates famously took 2 weeks per year called Think Weeks, where he went entirely alone to a secluded cabin with no staff, no meetings, and nothing but reading material and his own thoughts. The ideas and strategic decisions that emerged from those weeks shaped Microsoft's direction in ways that no boardroom meeting could replicate. This is not a coincidence. It is the neurological result of giving a brilliant mind the conditions it needs to operate at its highest level. You do not have to be Bill Gates to apply this principle. But you do have to be willing to defend your solitude, to say no to the social events that do not serve you, to turn off the noise that does not inform you, to sit with your own thoughts long enough for those thoughts to organize into something useful. The fourth mechanism, and perhaps the most undervalued, is the compounding of mental models over time. Every book you read carefully, every experience you reflect on deeply, every period of solitude in which you think clearly, these are deposits into a mental account that compounds in exactly the way financial investments compound. The earlier you start, the larger the eventual output. The more consistently you contribute, the more powerful the compounding effect. And at a certain point, the accumulated mental capital produces returns that seem almost magical to people who have not built it. The person who has spent 20 years building rich mental models of business, human psychology, economics, and history does not just think better than someone who has not. They think in a qualitatively different way. They see connections that others miss. They ask questions that others never thought to ask. They recognize the structure underneath surface events in a way that feels almost like intuition, but is actually pattern recognition built through decades of deliberate mental cultivation. This is the introvert's edge. It is not charm. It is not charisma. It is not the ability to work a room or build a personal brand. It is the accumulated output of thousands of hours of quiet, purposeful mental work. And in the wealth-building game, that output is worth more than almost any other skill. The world has spent decades celebrating extroversion, the talkers, the networkers, the charismatic leaders, the bold risk-takers who make decisions quickly and loudly, and many of those people do build wealth, at least for a time. But look at who builds wealth that lasts. Who builds wealth that sustains through downturns and disruptions and decades of change? Who builds wealth that does not require constant performance to maintain? Who builds wealth that grows quietly in the background, while the noisy world chases the next thing? Those people are almost always, when you look closely, the ones who protected their thinking, the ones who chose silence over stimulation, depth over breadth, and reflection over reaction, and that is a choice available to anyone willing to make it. Chapter 3. Thinking Before Spending. The quiet person's relationship with money. The relationship that most people have with money is fundamentally emotional, not rational, not strategic, emotional. Money triggers feelings of safety and danger, of adequacy and inadequacy, of belonging and exclusion. It activates social comparison circuits. It triggers fear responses. It produces euphoria when it arrives and anxiety when it leaves. And most people make their financial decisions from inside these emotional states, without realizing that the emotional state is driving the wheel. The quiet person has a different relationship with money, not because they are less human, less emotional, or less susceptible to the pressures that affect everyone else, but because they have developed the habit of creating a gap between the financial stimulus and the financial response, and in that gap lives everything. That gap is where thinking happens, where evaluation happens, where the question gets asked, is this decision coming from my values or from my emotions? Is this a rational allocation of resources, or is this my ego trying to feel something? Most people have no gap. They see, they feel, they act. The stimulus and the response are connected by an almost invisible wire of conditioning, social programming, and unexamined emotional need, and the financial system we all live inside is engineered precisely to exploit this. Every advertisement, every sale, every social media post from someone living a life that looks better than yours, every status signal embedded in every product and service is designed to short-circuit the gap and move you directly from feeling to spending. The quiet person has learned to cut that wire. They have learned, usually through painful experience or deep reflection, that the things they thought would make them feel wealthy often made them feel empty, that the purchases made from emotional need rather than deliberate choice produce satisfaction that lasts for hours or days before the underlying feeling returns, that the constant upgrade cycle, the new car, the bigger apartment, the better neighborhood, the newer phone, the nicer restaurant, is not a path to wealth, but a path that runs directly opposite to it. This realization does not make them miserly. It does not make them ascetics who deny themselves pleasure or comfort. The quiet millionaire is not the person who starves themselves of joy in the name of frugality. That is a poverty mindset wearing different clothes. The quiet millionaire is the person who has developed a clear, personal, examined relationship with what actually creates value and satisfaction in their life, and they have aligned their spending with that truth rather than with the preferences of a culture that profits from their insecurity. This is a profoundly different posture. When a quiet person considers a major purchase, they do not ask whether they can afford it. Most people who ask that question are asking the wrong question entirely. The question is not whether the money is in the account. The question is whether the expenditure represents the best use of that resource given everything they know about what actually makes their life better. That question requires thinking. It requires knowing yourself. It requires having a clear enough internal picture of your values and your actual sources of satisfaction that you can evaluate a financial decision against something real rather than against a feeling in the moment. And the quiet person, who has spent years building self-knowledge through reflection and solitude, is in a much stronger position to answer that question accurately. Consider the psychology of lifestyle inflation, one of the most powerful wealth-destroying forces in modern life. Lifestyle inflation is the near-universal tendency to increase spending as income increases. You get a raise, and within months your expenses have risen to absorb it. You build a successful business, and within a year your personal overhead has expanded to consume the additional margin. It happens naturally, automatically, almost invisibly, driven by a combination of social comparison, the desire for reward, and the cultural narrative that success should look a certain way. The quiet person is dramatically more resistant to lifestyle inflation, not because they are tougher or more disciplined in a white-knuckled sense, but because they never outsourced their definition of success to the culture in the first place. They built their own definition through internal reflection, and that definition does not automatically require more money to fulfill. When your sense of success comes from internal sources, progress on long-term goals, depth of knowledge, quality of relationships, creative output, the satisfaction of building something that will last, then external signals of success carry less weight. The pressure to upgrade, to expand, to display, to perform affluence is significantly reduced, and the money that is not spent on performing affluence compounds, year after year, decade after decade. This is one of the least discussed mechanisms of how quiet people build wealth, but it may be the most powerful, not the investment strategy, not the income optimization, the radical reduction in the cost of their psychological needs. Most people are spending enormous amounts of money on feelings, on the feeling of being successful, on the feeling of being admired, on the feeling of belonging to a certain class or group, on the feeling of security that comes from surrounding yourself with expensive things. The quiet person has done the internal work to produce those feelings from cheaper, more sustainable sources, from their own self-assessment, from the quality of their thinking, from the relationships they have built on the basis of genuine connection rather than social performance, from the progress they make toward goals that actually matter to them. This psychological efficiency translates directly into financial efficiency, and financial efficiency over time produces wealth. But there is another dimension of the quiet person's relationship with money that deserves examination, and that is their relationship with financial risk. Risk is the element of wealth building that most people get catastrophically wrong in one of two directions. They either fear it so much that they never take meaningful financial action, keeping their money in savings accounts that lose value to inflation while they wait for certainty that never comes, or they embrace it recklessly, drawn by excitement and the social proof of other people doing the same thing, without doing the fundamental work of understanding what they are actually risking or why. The quiet person takes a third path. They study risk. They understand it. They think about it not as something to fear or something to thrill at, but as something to evaluate with as much accuracy as possible and then accept or decline based on a clear-eyed analysis. This produces a style of investing and business building that is less exciting than the approaches that make the headlines but dramatically more effective over time. The quiet investor does not chase the hot stock. They do not follow the crowd into the trendy asset class. They do not make emotional pivots when markets drop. They have thought, in advance, about how they would respond to various scenarios, and when those scenarios arrive, they respond as planned, rather than as feared. This is psychological preparation as a wealth-building tool. Most people experience a market downturn as a sudden, terrifying event that requires an immediate emotional response. The quiet person has already spent time thinking about market downturns in advance, modeling what they would do, understanding why they chose the positions they chose, and building the rational conviction that allows them to hold when every emotional impulse is screaming at them to sell. That ability to hold through temporary pain for long-term gain is worth more than any trading strategy or market insight that has ever been sold in a course or a book or a seminar, and it comes from thinking before spending, before investing, before committing, from doing the internal work in advance, so that when the moment of pressure arrives, the decision has already been made from a place of clarity rather than fear. The quiet person's relationship with money is ultimately a relationship with themselves, and because they have invested deeply in understanding themselves, they have built a financial life that is genuinely theirs, shaped by their own values, their own analysis, and their own deliberately chosen priorities, rather than by the ambient pressure of a culture that profits from their confusion. This is not a luxury. It is available to anyone willing to do the work. But the work happens in silence. Chapter 4. The Power of Deep Focus. How quiet people out-earn loud competition. There is a new scarcity in the modern economy, not capital, not information, not even talent in the narrow technical sense. The new scarcity is attention, specifically the ability to give deep, sustained, undivided attention to a single problem or task for an extended period of time, the ability that psychologist and author Cal Newport calls deep work. The cognitive state in which a person pushes their mind to its limit, produces output that creates real value, and builds skills that are hard for others to replicate. This ability is becoming rarer and more valuable at the same time. Rarer because the world is waging a constant war against it. Every notification, every social media platform, every group chat, every open office, every expectation of constant availability is engineered, often deliberately, to fragment attention and prevent the conditions that deep work requires. And as people spend more of their cognitive bandwidth on shallow tasks, on email, on social media, on meetings that could have been messages, their capacity for deep work atrophies like a muscle that is never used. More valuable because the outputs of deep work are the outputs that the economy rewards most generously. The code that is elegant and fast. The analysis that identifies the pattern no one else saw. The strategy that accounts for dynamics that everyone else missed. The creative work that is genuinely original rather than a sophisticated remix of existing ideas. These outputs require deep focus, and they command premium prices precisely because fewer and fewer people can produce them. The quiet person has a built-in advantage here. They are less likely to be pulled into the constant social performance that fractures attention, less likely to check their phone every few minutes out of anxiety about what they might be missing, less likely to spend their most cognitively productive hours on activities that produce the feeling of work without the substance of it. They protect their focus the way a craftsman protects their tools, with deliberate care, with an understanding of what those tools are worth, with a refusal to allow them to be dulled by casual misuse. And the financial returns of this protection are enormous. Consider the difference between a person who works for 8 hours in a fragmented state, moving constantly between tasks, never achieving genuine depth on any of them, and a person who works for 4 hours of genuine deep focus followed by 4 hours of less demanding work. The output of the 4 focused hours, in terms of quality, insight, and economic value, will almost always exceed the output of the 8 fragmented ones, and the person doing the 4 hours of deep focus will have twice as much residual energy for the rest of their life. This is not theoretical. It is consistently demonstrated in the research on cognitive performance and work quality. But the quiet person's focus advantage goes beyond just their individual output. It extends to how they build skills over time. Skill development, genuine skill development that produces mastery rather than competence, requires sustained focus. You cannot develop a deep understanding of accounting by reading about it for 15 minutes a day while checking your phone. You cannot develop genuine expertise in real estate by consuming social media content about it. You cannot develop the pattern recognition that separates the good investor from the great one by skimming headlines. Mastery requires hours. Sustained, focused, deliberate hours. The quiet person accumulates these hours, not because they are more disciplined in some abstract sense, but because they have reduced the competition for their attention to the point where sustained focus is the path of least resistance, rather than a heroic effort. They go home after work and they read, not for 15 minutes, for 2 hours, and they do this for years. They work on a skill in the early morning when the world is still asleep and there are no notifications, no demands, no social obligations pulling at their attention. They sit with a complex problem and they stay with it, not because they have superior intellectual horsepower, but because they have the patience and the stillness to let the problem reveal itself over time. And the compounding of focused hours over years is one of the most powerful engines of income growth that exists. Here is what that compounding looks like in practice. A person who commits to 2 hours of deep, focused skill development per day will accumulate over 700 hours in a year. Over 5 years, that is more than 3,500 hours of genuine mastery-building practice in a chosen domain. At the 10-year mark, they have spent more than 7,000 hours in deliberate, focused practice in their field. That is the threshold of genuine expertise, real, deep, competitive expertise that takes years to develop and is virtually impossible to replicate through shortcuts. And the person who arrives at that threshold has not just built a skill, they have built a moat, a competitive moat around their economic life that is made of something far more durable than credentials, connections, or capital. It is made of actual capability, and actual capability, in a world hungry for it, commands its own price. This is how quiet people out-earn loud competition over the long run. Not through a dramatic, sudden victory, not through the kind of explosive success story that makes the news. Through the quiet, consistent, focused accumulation of genuine capability that the loud, distracted world is too fragmented to match. The loud competitor is attending networking events. The quiet one is reading the book that will change how they see the industry. The loud competitor is posting about their journey. The quiet one is on the journey. The loud competitor is performing expertise. The quiet one is building it. And 5 years later, 10 years later, 20 years later, the gap between them is not in their personality type or their genetic gifts. It is in the cumulative output of their hours, and the cumulative output of thousands of focused hours, quietly invested in the development of genuine skill, produces an economic result that the performance of expertise simply cannot touch. There is another dimension of the focus advantage that operates at the business level rather than the individual level. Quiet business builders tend to build better businesses, not flashier ones, not faster ones, better ones, more durable ones, more profitable ones, more defensible ones, because they are not building for the audience. They are not building to be seen or celebrated or featured in a magazine. They are building because they have identified a real problem and they want to solve it as completely and as excellently as they can. And that orientation, building for quality rather than visibility, tends to produce businesses that serve customers extraordinarily well. And businesses that serve customers extraordinarily well tend to produce extraordinary financial returns, not immediately, often not in the first few years. But over time, the compound interest of customer satisfaction, of a reputation built on actual performance rather than marketing, of a product or service that is genuinely excellent rather than impressively packaged, accumulates into something that the louder, flashier competitors cannot touch. The world remembers the noisy launch, but the world comes back for the quiet excellence, and the business built on quiet excellence does not need to spend its margin on a constant marketing performance. Its customers sell it, its reputation compounds, its dominance deepens without the enormous cost of maintaining a public image. This is the focus advantage applied at scale, and it is available to anyone willing to stop performing and start building. Chapter 5: Building Wealth in the Shadows. Quiet networking and silent influence. The word networking conjures a specific image for most people: a conference room full of people in business casual clothes, exchanging business cards with practiced smiles, delivering 30-second elevator pitches to strangers who are already scanning the room for someone more useful to talk to. The transactional performance of relationship building, the loud, effortful, exhausting ritual of collecting contacts and hoping that enough of them will eventually pay off. Quiet people tend to hate this, and rightly so, not because they are antisocial, not because they do not understand the value of relationships, but because they recognize, often very clearly, that this particular ritual produces relationships of almost no depth, that the business card exchanged at the conference is almost never the beginning of a meaningful professional connection, that the performed warmth of a networking event rarely generates the kind of trust that actually produces opportunities, referrals, partnerships, or genuine support. And the quiet person is right, because the research on how high-value professional relationships actually form tells a very different story than the one the networking industry sells. High-value professional relationships are almost always formed through shared work, not shared introduction. They form when two people collaborate on something real, encounter genuine difficulty together, discover each other's capabilities and character under conditions that actually test both. They form through repeated, low-key interaction over time, through the slow accumulation of trust that is built not through a memorable first impression, but through consistent, reliable, genuine behavior across dozens of small encounters. The quiet person builds this kind of relationship exceptionally well, not through high-volume contact collection. Through depth, they identify a small number of people who they genuinely respect and find interesting. They invest real attention in understanding those people. They remember what those people care about, what they are working on, what challenges they are facing. They reach out at appropriate moments with something genuinely useful: an article, an introduction, an observation, a piece of information that is relevant to what they know the person is thinking about, not to perform generosity, but because they have been paying attention, and the relevant thing presents itself naturally. This approach builds relationships that are qualitatively different from the ones produced by high-volume networking. They are fewer in number but vastly higher in quality, and in the wealth-building context, 5 genuinely deep professional relationships are worth more than 500 shallow ones by almost any measure. The quiet person also builds influence differently. In a world saturated with loud voices all competing for attention, one of the most powerful positions you can occupy is the position of the trusted counsel. The person who does not broadcast their opinions widely, but who, when they do speak, is listened to with unusual attention. The person who has built a reputation not for the volume of their output, but for the quality of it. The person whose endorsement, recommendation, or opinion carries real weight precisely because it is not given casually. This is the quiet influence position, and in professional and financial circles, it is extraordinarily powerful. Consider how high-value opportunities actually flow in business and finance. They rarely flow through public channels. The best investment deals are not posted on public platforms. The most interesting business opportunities are not widely advertised. The positions that change careers are not always listed on job boards. These opportunities flow through networks of trust. They go to people who are known by the people doing the distributing, to be reliable, capable, discreet, and trustworthy. The quiet person is exceptionally well positioned to be in these networks of trust, because the qualities that earn a place in such networks are precisely the quiet virtues: reliability, discretion, genuine capability demonstrated over time rather than claimed loudly up front. The track record of delivering on what they committed to without drama, without excuse, and without requiring constant management. The loud person might impress at the introduction. The quiet person sustains the impression through actual performance, and in the world of high-value opportunity, sustained performance is the credential that matters. There is a specific practice that quiet wealth builders use that is worth examining in detail, and it is the practice of strategic generosity, not the performative generosity of public charity or the transactional generosity of giving to get. Strategic generosity is the genuine, thoughtful practice of providing value to the people in your network without keeping score, without expecting immediate return, and without announcing it. This might look like introducing two people who you believe will genuinely benefit from knowing each other. It might look like sharing a piece of information, an analysis, a resource that you know is directly relevant to a challenge someone you respect is facing. It might look like spending an hour with a younger professional who reminds you of yourself, sharing the hard lessons that took you years to learn. None of these gestures make noise. None of them are visible on social media. None of them produce an immediate financial return that can be tracked on a spreadsheet. But over years and decades, the compound interest of this kind of quiet generosity builds something extraordinary. It builds a reputation as someone who adds value. It builds deep goodwill among people who have real resources, real influence, and real opportunities to share. It builds the kind of reciprocal desire to help that cannot be manufactured through networking events or social media strategy, but emerges naturally and powerfully from genuine, sustained, understated generosity. The quiet person's network is a long-term asset built through genuine care, genuine attention, and genuine value creation. It is not wide, it is deep. And depth, in professional relationships as in everything else, is what produces lasting return. There is one more element of the quiet person's social strategy that deserves attention, and it is their relationship with reputation. The loud person builds reputation through publicity, through the constant projection of a personal brand, through stories of success, through the careful management of public image. And this can work. Publicity produces visibility. Visibility produces opportunity. But publicity-based reputation is expensive to build and fragile to maintain. One public failure, one moment of inconsistency between the brand and the behavior, and the carefully constructed image fractures in ways that can take years to repair. The quiet person builds reputation through behavior, through the accumulation of consistent, reliable, high-quality action over time, through always doing what they said they would do, through being exactly the same whether or not anyone is watching, through the slow, invisible compounding of a track record built on actual performance rather than projected image. This kind of reputation is harder to build quickly, but it is virtually impossible to destroy, because it is not located in a perception that can be shifted by a public narrative. It is located in the direct experience of everyone who has ever interacted with the quiet person. And that kind of reputation, earned through decades of behavioral consistency, becomes one of the most powerful wealth-generating assets a person can possess. It opens doors that no amount of publicity can open, because the people who control the highest quality opportunities do not look for the loudest person in the room. They look for the one they trust absolutely, and absolute trust is built in silence. Chapter 6. The Compounding Life. Patience, discipline, and the long game. Albert Einstein, whether or not he actually said it, is often credited with calling compound interest the eighth wonder of the world, the idea being that those who understand it earn it, and those who do not pay it. This is true about money, but it is equally true about life. Everything of genuine value in human existence is compounded. Wealth compounds, knowledge compounds, skills compound, relationships compound, reputation compounds, health compounds, and the character traits that make a person effective and admirable, integrity, patience, self-discipline, curiosity, compound with the most extraordinary power of all. The quiet person understands compounding in a way that the loud, impatient, short-term focused world does not. Not just intellectually, in their bones, in the choices they make day after day, in the way they structure their time, in the way they think about where they are going and how long they are willing to take to get there. And this orientation toward the long game is, without exaggeration, the single most powerful driver of the gap between the quietly wealthy and the loudly broke. Consider two people starting at 25. The first person is excited about wealth. They are constantly looking for the big break, the hot investment, the business that will explode, the shortcut that will accelerate their arrival at the destination. They move quickly, they take dramatic action, they make bold bets. Some of those bets pay off and they talk about them enthusiastically. Others fail and they move on quickly to the next opportunity. They experience the volatility of a high-risk, high-attention approach to financial life. Some good years, some terrible ones. Significant income at times, significant setbacks at others. By 55, they have had an exciting financial life. They have stories to tell, but the net result, the actual accumulated wealth, the resources available to sustain them through the rest of their life, is unremarkable. The second person is quiet about wealth. They are not looking for the big break, they are looking for the consistent process. They identify a sound investment approach early and they stay with it through the ups and the downs. They invest a fixed percentage of their income every month, without drama, without excitement, without deviation based on what the market is doing or what the financial news is saying. They develop a valuable skill slowly and they keep developing it, not switching careers every time something else looks more interesting. They build their business or their career with the patience of someone who has deeply internalized the truth that real results take real time. They do not have exciting stories to tell at dinner parties. They do not have dramatic reversals of fortune or narrow escapes from disaster. They have, instead, the quiet, steady accumulation of a life played on the long game. And by 55, the numbers tell a story that shocks people who only looked at the surface. This is not fiction. This is basic compound mathematics applied to human behavior over time. The returns of a patient, consistent, long-term investor dwarf the returns of an excited, volatile, trend-chasing one over sufficiently long periods, not because of superior intelligence or superior access to information, because of time in the market, consistency of contribution, and the complete absence of the large setbacks that come from reactive decision-making. But the compounding principle extends far beyond investment returns. It applies to the entire architecture of a life. Consider knowledge. The quiet person who reads seriously for 2 hours a day accumulates, over a decade, a depth and breadth of understanding that is simply not available to the person who consumes media for 2 hours a day. Not a marginal difference. A fundamental qualitative difference in the kind of thinking they can do, the quality of decisions they can make, and the value they can create in the world. Consider relationships. The quiet person who invests genuinely in a small number of deep relationships over decades develops, through that investment, connections of extraordinary trust and mutual value. These relationships, at their depth, provide opportunities, support, wisdom and resources that no amount of casual networking can replicate. Consider reputation. The quiet person who behaves with complete integrity in every interaction, large and small, visible and invisible, builds over decades a reputation that precedes them in every room they enter. A reputation built not on projection, but on performance. And that reputation, at its depth, opens doors that are invisible to anyone who has not built the same thing over the same amount of time. Every one of these is compound interest of a non-financial variety. And the person who has optimized for all of them simultaneously, who has built financial capital, knowledge capital, relational capital, and reputational capital in parallel over decades, has built something that is extraordinary by any measure. But it requires the one thing that the modern world most aggressively attacks: patience. Not passive waiting, not the patience of someone who has no plan and is hoping something good will happen. Active patience. The patience of someone who has a clear long-term plan, who is executing that plan consistently, and who has the discipline not to abandon the plan when it feels boring, when something else looks more exciting, or when the short-term results do not match the long-term vision. This kind of patience is a skill. It is developed through practice, through deliberately keeping commitments even when you do not feel like it, through staying in the investment through the downturn, through continuing to develop the skill even when progress feels invisible, through maintaining the relationship even when it does not seem to be producing anything tangible. Each of these small acts of patience is a deposit into an account whose balance only becomes visible over years and decades. And quiet people, who are less driven by the need for immediate external validation, who derive satisfaction from internal sources rather than from the applause of the crowd, are naturally better at making these deposits consistently. They do not need the quick win to maintain their commitment. They are sustained by the conviction of their process, by the understanding that what they are building is real, and that real things take real time. The compounding life is also a life of discipline, and discipline in this context does not mean deprivation or suffering. It means the alignment of consistent behavior with deliberate intention. It means waking up every morning and doing the thing that serves the long-term plan, even when the short-term feeling says otherwise. The quiet person has a natural advantage in discipline because their internal life is orderly. They are not fighting a constant battle against the noise and stimulation of an overstimulated existence. They have created an environment, both internal and external, in which the disciplined behavior is the natural behavior, where the default is the right action rather than the comfortable one. This is what makes the compounding life actually livable. Not the heroic white-knuckled performance of discipline under duress, but the quiet, sustainable, almost effortless consistency of someone whose environment and internal architecture make the right choice the easy choice. That architecture is built through the habits and practices described throughout this book, through the cultivation of stillness, through the development of self-knowledge, through the protection of attention and focus, through the building of deep relationships and deep skills and deep financial positions. All of it compounds. All of it builds on all of it. And the person who builds it all, quietly, consistently, over decades, arrives at a place that looks, to everyone who only sees the surface, like extraordinary luck. It is not luck. It is compound interest on a life well lived. Chapter 7. The Quiet Millionaire's Blueprint. Putting it all together. Everything in this book has been pointing toward this chapter. The principles, the psychology, the practices, the mindset, the mechanisms through which quiet people build wealth faster than the loud, impatient, performance-driven world around them. It all converges here into a set of practical, actionable commitments that constitute what I am calling the Quiet Millionaire's Blueprint. This is not a 12-step program or a rigid formula. It is a framework, a way of organizing your financial and personal life around the principles that have been demonstrated through the lives of quietly wealthy people across centuries of human history to produce genuine, lasting, compounding wealth. It begins with clarity. Before any investment, before any business decision, before any strategic action, the quiet millionaire builds clarity about three things: what they actually want, what they actually value, and what kind of life they are actually trying to build. Not what they think they should want, not what the culture tells them to want, not what their peers seem to be pursuing, what they actually personally deeply want. This clarity is built through the practices of reflection and solitude described earlier, through journaling, through honest self-interrogation, through the deliberate quieting of external noise long enough to hear the internal signal clearly. Most people never do this work. They spend their entire financial lives pursuing goals that were not actually theirs, optimizing for a version of success that does not actually produce the satisfaction they are after, and they arrive at the destination, if they arrive at all, and find that it does not feel the way they thought it would, because it was someone else's destination. The quiet millionaire knows their destination, and that knowledge shapes every decision downstream. The second element of the blueprint is financial simplicity. The quietly wealthy almost always have simpler financial lives than you would expect. They do not have dozens of investment accounts, 20 different assets, complex tax structures, or a financial life that requires constant management and attention. They have made a small number of very good decisions, and they have stayed with them. They own their home, or they have chosen deliberately not to and have deployed that capital elsewhere. They invest consistently in a small number of well-understood assets. They have a business or a career that they have developed over years into something that generates strong, reliable income. They have eliminated debt that carries high interest, and they do not take on new debt casually. The financial simplicity is not just an aesthetic choice, it is a strategic one. Simple financial lives are easier to manage, harder to get wrong, less likely to be derailed by complexity, and more resilient in the face of unexpected disruption. Every layer of financial complexity you add is another layer of potential failure, another thing to manage, another risk you may not fully understand, another moving piece that can malfunction when conditions change. The quiet millionaire strips this complexity down to the essentials. They understand everything they own. They could explain every financial position they hold in plain language to a reasonably intelligent non-expert. They have no financial secrets from themselves. And this clarity and simplicity means that when they make a decision, it is made with full information about how it fits into the whole. The third element is income architecture. The quietly wealthy understand something about income that most people do not. They understand that the structure of your income matters as much as the amount of it. An income that is entirely dependent on your continued presence and effort is fragile in a way that is easy to ignore until something goes wrong. An income that has been partially or fully decoupled from the direct exchange of your time is something qualitatively different. It is an asset, and building that asset is the work of years. The blueprint calls for a deliberate, patient strategy of building income streams that require less and less direct time investment over time. This might mean building a business that can eventually operate with reduced owner involvement. It might mean building an investment portfolio that generates dividends or rental income. It might mean creating intellectual property that generates royalties. It might mean developing a skill to such a level of mastery that it commands rates that make the hours equation dramatically more favorable. The specific path varies by person, but the principle is universal. Move over time from trading time for money toward owning assets that generate money, and do this quietly, consistently, without announcing the process or waiting for someone to validate that it is the right approach. The fourth element is cost discipline without deprivation. The quiet millionaire does not live like an ascetic. They do not deny themselves the things that genuinely enrich their life, but they have done the work to know the difference between spending that genuinely enriches their life and spending that is driven by emotion, ego, or social comparison. They spend generously on the things that align with their actual values, the experiences that create genuine meaning, the relationships that deserve investment, the tools and education that genuinely build their capability, the health investments that sustain the physical platform through which everything else is possible. And they spend almost nothing on the things that do not, on the status signals that serve social performance rather than personal satisfaction, on the lifestyle upgrades that produce diminishing returns, on the subscriptions, memberships, and acquisitions that accumulate without producing genuine value in the life. This requires regular, honest self-examination. The quiet millionaire looks at their spending periodically, not to perform frugality, but to ask honestly whether their spending patterns are actually aligned with their stated values. and they are willing to make changes based on what the honest examination reveals. The fifth element is the long-term investment in human capital. The blueprint calls for a sustained, permanent commitment to becoming more valuable, more knowledgeable, more skilled, more effective. Not because someone is watching, not because there is an immediate financial return, but because the compound interest of genuine human development over decades is one of the most reliable generators of financial return that exists. This means reading seriously and widely, not just in your immediate professional domain, but in the adjacent areas that inform it. History, psychology, organizational behavior, the biographies of people who built things that lasted, the philosophical traditions that have thought deeply about how to live well, the scientific literature that describes how humans actually think and decide rather than how we imagine we do. It means developing your skills through deliberate practice rather than passive accumulation of experience, seeking feedback that is honest even when it is uncomfortable, putting yourself in situations that require genuine stretch, rather than the comfortable repetition of established competence. It means protecting the conditions that allow deep thinking, the hours of solitude, the slow reading, the long walks where the mind is allowed to range freely and make the connections that do not emerge on demand, the conversations with people who think differently than you do and are willing to challenge your assumptions. All of this is investment, and all of it compounds. The sixth element is relationship architecture. The blueprint calls for a deliberately small, deliberately deep network of genuine professional relationships, not the wide, shallow, performance-based network of the conference circuit. A small number of relationships built on actual mutual respect, genuine interest, and demonstrated trustworthiness over time. The Quiet Millionaire tends and deepens these relationships with genuine attention and genuine generosity. They show up consistently, they add value consistently, they maintain contact not through automated sequences or social media performance, but through genuine personal, thoughtful outreach based on actual knowledge of what the other person is going through. And over decades, these relationships become one of the most valuable assets in the entire portfolio, not because they have been strategically cultivated for financial return, though the financial return will come, but because they represent real human connection built on real mutual regard. And real human connection, at sufficient depth, opens every door that matters. The seventh element, and perhaps the most important, is what I call the maintenance of the quiet. Because everything in this blueprint requires a particular internal environment to sustain. It requires a mind that is not constantly overstimulated, a psychology that is not driven primarily by social comparison and external validation, an attention that is not endlessly fragmented by the noise of the connected world. The Quiet Millionaire makes deliberate, ongoing choices to protect this internal environment. They limit their exposure to financial media that provokes emotional reactivity rather than rational analysis. They are selective about the social environments they spend time in, choosing depth over breadth, genuine connection over social performance. They build daily routines that include periods of genuine stillness, periods of genuine focus, periods of genuine reflection. They treat the quality of their internal life not as a luxury or a nicety, but as a foundational infrastructure requirement, because they understand that everything else in the blueprint, the financial decisions, the skill development, the relationship building, the compounding patience, flows from the quality of that internal environment. A noisy internal environment produces noisy, reactive, emotionally driven decisions regardless of how much good information you feed into it. A quiet internal environment produces clear, calibrated, patient, deeply considered decisions regardless of how volatile and confusing the external world becomes. And in a world that is becoming louder, more volatile, more confusing, and more emotionally manipulative by the year, the person who has built and maintained a quiet internal environment has a competitive and financial advantage that will only grow more valuable as time passes. This is the blueprint, not a formula, not a guaranteed system, a way of orienting your entire life toward the principles that quietly wealthy people have demonstrated across cultures and centuries and economic conditions to produce genuine, lasting, compounding wealth. It does not require you to be born into money. It does not require a specific personality type, a specific level of intelligence, or a specific set of circumstances. It requires only the willingness to move more slowly than the world tells you to think more deeply than the world rewards you to build more quietly than the world notices you doing, and then to stay in the game long enough for the compounding to do what compounding always does when given enough time. Make the invisible visible. Make the small large. Make the quiet extraordinary. There is a man sitting in a corner office on the 42nd floor of a glass tower. He did not get there by being the loudest. He got there by being the most patient, the most focused, the most deliberate, the most willing to do the quiet work in the quiet hours that the loud world was spending on performance. He did not announce his journey. He did not document his strategy on social media. He did not attend every conference or collect every business card or chase every trend that promised to accelerate his arrival. He simply showed up day after day and did the work, quietly, consistently, with a patience that most people would have abandoned years before the results became visible. And now the results are visible, but more importantly, they are his, built on his values, aligned with his actual life, not borrowed from someone else's idea of success, not purchased with borrowed identity or borrowed validation. His. You can build something like that, not identical to it. Your wealth will have the shape of your life, your values, your capabilities, your particular corner of the world and time. But the principles that built his are available to you, and they have been available throughout every chapter of this book, in every example, in every mechanism, in every quiet practice that quietly wealthy people have used for as long as there have been quietly wealthy people. The world will continue to reward the noise in the short term. It will continue to celebrate the flashy and the bold and the dramatically visible, and many of those celebrations will produce brief, brilliant financial moments that look, from the outside, like the whole story. They are not the whole story. The whole story is always written in the long run, in the compounding, in the patient accumulation of the right things in the right amounts over the right period of time. That story is still being written, and you hold the pen. Write it quietly, write it well,